It's my pleasure to welcome everyone to our KPPC lecture series from the first nudge unit in the world. Today, lecture is on Nudging Britain, stories from the UK's Quiet Revolution. How can we help people to find a job, to save for retirement, to do better in their exams? The lecture will present case studies from the UK's Behavioural Insights team and showing how small changes can make a big difference. We are pleased to welcome our guest speaker, Mrs. Eve Taylor, a senior advisor from the first nudge unit in the world, the Behavioural Insights team in the UK. Before we start the lecture, please allow me to thank the British Embassy in Kuwait for collaborating with us to bring Ms. Evie. We will open the floor for questions during our Q&A session at the end of the lecture. Mrs. Evie, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you so much to the KPPC for the invite to come and speak to you all and give you an introduction to some of the work we've done in the UK, applying concepts from behavioural science to public policy problems. Before I do that, I just wanted to start with a game to check that you are all fresh and you're not too sleepy on this Monday morning. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a series of images, and I'm going to ask you to try and remember as many of the images as you can. So before we do that, has everyone got a pen and paper ready, or your mobile phone so you can take notes afterwards? Because you're going to need to remember the images and write them down once you've seen them. I'll just give you a second to get ready for that. Okay, if everyone's ready, I'm going to start the pictures. Here we go. Okay? Try and remember as many as you can. Ooh, whoops, hold on. There we go. Okay, now write down as many as you can, as many as you remember. Okay, so how many did you remember? There were 14 images. Did anyone remember 14? I don't believe you. I just don't believe you. 14 is too many. 6, okay. Anyone got more than 6, 7, 8, 10, 11? Okay, that's pretty good. Well, I'm glad that you proved that you can write down the names of things. That's great. Okay, so what I want you to do now is I'm going to show you some of the images I showed you, and they're going to be in pairs. And only if you have both of these images, I want you to put your hand up. So, did anyone get both cow and helicopter? Okay, and everyone just look around keep your hands up, please, people who got it. Everyone just look around at who got that pair. Okay, a couple of you. Did anyone get both apples and policemen? Okay, everyone look around. Do you see slightly more people have their hands up now? Okay. Did anyone get both music and washing machine? Everybody look around. A couple of you got music and washing machine. Okay. And did anyone get both clock and dog? Okay, everybody have a look around at how many people got it. Okay. So, did anyone notice that more people got apples and policemen and clock and dog than these top rows, these top two pairs? Does anyone know why that might be? Correct. These two people, it is indeed the beginning and the end of the sequence. So you can see here, this is the sequence I showed you, and apples and policemen came right at the beginning, and clock and dog came right at the end. So that's just a short exercise, but the question is, why does that matter? This is something that we call in behavioural insights primacy and recency effects. And this is when you look at someone's attention, this is how their attention works for any given experience. You pay attention at the beginning, and you pay attention at the end of any experience. And what's important about this is a lesson we should use when we're thinking about how we design public services, how we write a letter, how we design any experience. If you have a message you want to get across, put the message at the beginning and put the message at the end, because no one will remember what happens in the middle. So that's just a short exercise to show you how we can use behavioural insights to design better policy. I'm assured that you all already know what behavioural insights is, but in case anyone has missed any others of these lectures, I thought I'd give you a very quick recap. So the idea is that Daniel Kahneman, who is one of the founding fathers of behavioural economics, he says there's two ways that we think. One of the ways we think is what he calls system two. And this is traditionally how public services and public policy has been designed, with this kind of thinking in mind. And this kind of thinking is what Daniel Kahneman calls slow thinking. It's deliberative, it's slow, it's analytic. When I say to you, what's 24 times 17, it's difficult. You have to think it through. You might think, what's 24 times 10, what's 24 times 7, and you might add them together. You have to make a mental effort to do that. It's when you're planning a trip overseas, when you're coming to Kuwait and you don't know where to stay or how to get anywhere. This is the system two slow thinking. And this is what normal public policy is designed with this kind of thinking in mind. We think that when someone looks at a motorbike and thinks about whether or not they're going to steal that motorbike, they think carefully and they weigh up the pros and cons of stealing the motorbike. How likely is it that they're going to get caught? What is the punishment that will happen to them if they do get caught? And then once they've weighed up the costs and benefits, they make a careful decision and then they decide whether or not to steal the motorbike. In fact, we know that that's not how a lot of us think a lot of the time. What behavioural economics says is that a lot of the time we think fast. We think under system one. So system one is fast, intuitive, effortless thinking. When I say to you what's 2 times 2, the number 4 has already popped into your head. Or when you're taking your journey to work, you know it so well, you don't even have to think. And this is how a lot of us think most of the time, and so we should design public services and public policy to take this into account. Because when we're thinking in system one, it turns out that environmental effects on behaviour are much stronger than you would expect. So the environment in which someone is making a choice, how you present the environment, really affects the choices people subsequently make. For instance, if you put chocolate bars at the checkout in a supermarket, people might not have thought they wanted a chocolate bar, but they think, "Ooh, that looks nice, maybe I'll have one of those." And before you know it, it's in your plastic bag and everyone's got very fat very quickly. So the environment really matters. Here's another example of how the environment can affect decisions. This is an experiment that was done by an Australian criminologist called David Tate. And what he did was he wanted to investigate the difference between putting the defendant in a criminal trial at the bar table, i.e. sitting next to their legal counsel, which is the traditional American system, or in an open dock, which is how we have the defendant in the UK, so they're standing in a box looking at the court, or in a glass cage, so they're in a dock but it has glass around it. In some countries, in some extreme circumstances, there are also bars, but he just tested glass cage versus open dock versus bar table. And what he did was he ran an experiment where he got actors to play a defendant and to play a judge, and he hosted real court cases, just as they had been in real life in courts. And he invited members of the public to act as jurors in these cases. And then he hosted these trials multiple times, and he looked at the likelihood of the defendant being prosecuted, being found guilty, based on where they were sitting in the court. And these things matter. Obviously, this was just an experiment, and so it's not, life and death. It's not real prison sentences we're talking about. But people, nonetheless, had sat through, days of evidence. They'd sat through what they thought was a real court case, or what felt like a real court case, and then made a decision. And this is what he found. He found that if the defendant was sitting in a glass cage, he was prosecuted. He was found guilty by the jurors 60% of the time. If he was sitting in an open dock, he was found guilty only 47% of the time. And if he was sitting at a bar table next to his legal counsel, he was found guilty only 36% of the time. So the point here is that the environment matters. You would think when someone's watching a criminal trial that they're thinking carefully about the decision they're making. But actually it turns out just where the defendant is sitting can have a huge impact on the decisions people make. Okay, so that's a little introduction. on to today's talk. So this is the 2035 development plan, I understand. And what I've tried to do is to bring you the case studies from the UK that fit under 3 of the pillars. So I'm going to talk first about healthcare and I'm going to show you 3 trials we've done in the UK to try to improve health outcomes. I'm then going to talk about human capital, well, education and skills. How can we help pupils to do better at school? And finally, I'm going to talk about economy. And I'm going to show you 3 different trials, one about getting people into work, one about encouraging businesses to grow, and another one about citizens' financial capability. So that's the structure of the talk. I'm also going to give you a quick introduction to the team, and there's one bonus trial that I'm going to show at the end, just because I really like it, and I thought you'd like it too. Okay, so an introduction to the team. So if you follow British politics closely, you will know that this is David Cameron and Nick Clegg, who formed a coalition government in 2010, which seems like an absolute lifetime ago in British politics, but anyway. So they formed this coalition government in 2010, and importantly, one of David Cameron's advisors had read the book Nudge, which some of you in the audience may have read. It's by Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein, and kind of brings together a lot of the research that had been done in behavioral economics since Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky had started their work. And basically, Nudge is about how you can use principles from behavioral economics to make people healthier, wealthier, and happier. And David Cameron's advisors thought that he could use some of the principles in that book and apply them to the delivery of UK public services and improve UK public services. And so, in the coalition agreement between these 2, they included this line: our government will find intelligent ways to encourage, support, and enable people to make better choices for themselves. And it was this line which kind of brought into being the Nudge Unit, as it was known then, and the Behavioural Insights team, as it's known now, which is the team I work for. So this is a picture of some of the team, looking a bit younger than they are now. And the team started life inside Number 10, and then after that, Cabinet Office, still inside the UK government. And then in 2014, we spun out of the UK government to become a social purpose company, which is what we are now, but we are still a third owned by the UK Cabinet Office. So we're government mutual. And then, as now, there were 2 sides to our work. So the first side is using principles from the behavioral sciences, so behavioral economics, psychology, sociology, to come up with ideas for how to improve the delivery of public services. And when we say that, we don't mean, when we talk about coming up with these ideas, we do not mean that we're replacing the traditional government levers of laws and regulation, incentives and fines, and information. These levers are really, really important, and they are very good and valid ways of changing behaviour. What we intend to do with Behavioural Insights is to improve the way these levers are delivered. So for instance, you want me to take it off? Oh, it's still down. Okay. Is that on? Oh. Okay, slight technical hitch. So we don't mean to replace these traditional levers, we mean to augment them and improve them. So for instance, if you talk about laws and regulation, in the UK it's the law that if you have witnessed a crime, that you should come to court to give evidence, and indeed the police can come to your house and pick you up if you don't come and give evidence in the trial against the person who is being accused of that crime. And so that's great, so it's good to have that law. We need people to come to court to give evidence. But a lot of the time people don't turn up. And actually that's a really, really big problem in the UK, because a lot of the court cases then collapse, which means justice isn't done, and also a lot of money and time is wasted on behalf of both the government prosecuting and the defendant's team. So for instance, if we want someone to come to court to give evidence, we shouldn't just have a law saying you must come to court. We should also think about how can we make it as easy as possible for that person to come to court. So for instance, say it's a mother, why don't we help them to arrange childcare? Or why don't we have childcare on site at the court? Or for instance, why don't we encourage the person to plan their journey to the court, to think carefully about how they're going to get there, what transport they're going to use, etc. Because we know from behavioural insights that if you encourage people to plan, they're much more likely to achieve a goal. Or for instance, let's take information, and let's talk about, for instance, diabetic patients. You might provide them with information about how to eat more healthily or how to exercise more, and what kind of exercise they need to do to get the right amount of exercise per week. And so we think that's important, and that's absolutely the right thing to do. But behavioural insights tells us that who delivers that message is important. So for instance, if it's a diabetic patient, is it better if that message comes from the doctor, or from a nurse, or from a dietitian, or from another diabetic patient? The messenger matters almost as much as the message itself. So this is the kind of thing that's important with behavioural insights, and the kind of ways we can augment these traditional levers. So the second side of our work, apart from coming up with ideas for how to improve public service delivery, is running randomized controlled trials to test the effectiveness of those ideas. So you might be familiar with randomized controlled trials from the medical context. What you do is you get a very large group of people, you randomly divide them into two groups, and in the medical context you give one group the treatment and you give another group the placebo, and then you look at outcomes between the two groups to see whether or not the treatment has worked. We do exactly that, but in public policy. So essentially you get a large group of people, say taxpayers, you randomly divide them into two groups, you give one of them the new behavioural insights letter, and you give the other group the business as usual letter that's already sent out by the tax authority, and then you wait a couple of weeks and you see if they pay their tax, and you compare outcomes between the two of them. Now this is really important. This is the gold standard of evaluation. This is the best way of knowing if something actually works. And this is one of the most important things we have also brought to the UK government, is a desire and ability to do evidence-based policy. Partly we needed to do this because we make very small changes to existing services and people don't believe us otherwise that they work, because they say there's no way one line on a letter can have that kind of effect. But also because this is important. Before you spend millions of pounds rolling out a policy, you should know whether it works. And it's important to say that today I'm going to show you examples of things we've done that have worked, but around 20 to 30% of what we do does not work, and that's okay. And it's really important that we know that it doesn't work and that we've trialed it and we've tested it before we roll it out. So that's the second side of our work. And then finally, to finish off the introduction, as I mentioned, we became a social purpose company in 2014, and that's allowed us to work with lots of different governments around the world. So we're now not just in the UK, we also have offices in the US, Singapore, Sydney and Wellington in New Zealand. And we've also worked with lots of governments around the world looking at how to apply behavioural insights. Okay, so on to today's talk and talking about some case studies from the UK. You might be wondering why I called it the quiet revolution. I've called it that because what I'm going to show you are, I guess, what lots of people would call nudges, but these aren't huge, flashy, expensive campaigns. These are small changes which have a disproportionate impact. These are small changes in the way government is done that have really had quite a disproportionate impact. Okay, so let's start with health. Really important, really expensive to get health right. And one that matters a lot in the UK, because in case you don't know, in the UK we have the National Health Service, and health is delivered entirely by the government and free at the point of use. So these are some things that matter a lot to the UK government budgets, basically. Okay, so the first example is, how can we reduce the number of missed appointments at UK hospitals? So in the UK every year there are around 53 million outpatient appointments at hospitals, and around 10% of those appointments are missed by patients. And every time an appointment is missed, it costs the NHS, the National Health Service, about £100. So what we're talking about is the value of missed appointments in the UK is around £500 million of money that could otherwise be spent on other health outcomes. So this really matters, and hospitals really want people to either turn up to their appointment if they have one, or if they're not going to turn up, tell them and cancel it so they can then give the appointment to someone else who's on the waiting list and who needs it. And we'll come on to waiting lists in a second and you'll see why we need it so much. And so what we did was, there was already a growing amount of evidence around how text message reminders can encourage people to turn up to their appointments and reduce the number of appointments that are missed. But what we did was we looked at whether you could use behavioural insights to increase the effectiveness of these reminders. So currently, before someone's appointment, they were sent this text message. So your appointment is at Hospital X on September 16th at 10 AM. To cancel or rearrange, call the number on your appointment letter. So this was standard. Was already being sent out to everyone to remind them that their appointment was going to happen, which is obviously good. It's very good to send people reminders. But we looked at whether behavioural insights could improve this. So the first thing we did was we put the number that they needed to call in the text message. So you might not think this is rocket science, but whoever invented this message clearly didn't think this might be a good idea. This is one of the most important lessons that you should take away today, and one of the most important lessons from behavioural insights generally, which is if you want someone to do something, make it as easy as possible. So here, to cancel or rearrange, call the number on your appointment letter. I don't know where my appointment letter is. I might have thrown it away. It's in a massive pile of papers. It's very hard to find the number. So I look for it for 2 minutes. I can't find the number. So I give up and I don't bother to call the hospital because it's just too difficult. That kind of thing happens every single day. So this is a very simple way of just making it easier for people to call. They can literally click that number and they can call immediately. So that's good. The second one is a social norm. So we are very social beings, us humans, and we like to do what everyone else is doing. If we go to a new country and we want to know which side of the escalator we need to stand on, we'll look at what has everyone else done and we'll copy their behaviour. We'll copy their lead. So social norms can be very, very effective at changing behaviour. If you tell people that 9 out of 10 people do something, which in this case is true, as I said, 10% of people don't turn up, which means 9 out of 10 people do attend, then that can be very effective at encouraging them themselves to attend because they want to do what everyone else is doing. And then costs. So this is something that is very specific to the UK, I think, in the sense that people love the National Health Service. And what we thought was that by talking about the effect that not attending has on the National Health Service, so telling them that not attending costs the NHS £160 approximately, we thought that might have an impact because people would feel they don't want to deprive the NHS of that money, which could be used on other patients. So this is what we did. We had these 4 text messages, and we randomly allocated patients at a London Health Trust who had appointments coming up at the hospital to get one of these 4 messages, right? So these are the results. You can see that around 11% of people in the control didn't turn up and didn't attend their appointment and didn't cancel it. When you put the number and you make it slightly easier, you see that around 9.8% don't turn up. Norms is slightly less good, around 10% don't turn up. And then costs, telling people how much it costs the NHS. So decreased the number of people who didn't turn up by around 25%. So you might be saying, okay, that's only, you're talking about 2.5 percentage points. That's not really a very big impact. But actually, if you rolled that out across the whole of England, that would be the equivalent to 400,000 appointments that wouldn't be missed. And remember, each appointment costs £100. So this is actually quite a large impact for a very, very small change in the text message. Incidentally, by the way, with social norms, you need to be really, really careful because they work both ways, right? If you tell people that lots of other people are doing a bad behaviour, you can have exactly the opposite effect to what you intended. So at my local GP surgery in the UK, they have a sign up that said last month 500 people didn't attend their GP's appointment. And the point is they're saying, isn't this awful, you should definitely attend. But in practice, I suspect the effect they're having is they're telling them loads of other people don't turn up to their appointments, you don't need to either. So you need to be really careful when you use social norms. It needs to be the behaviour you want to encourage, not a behaviour you want to discourage. So that's the first example. The second example is around how you can decrease wait times from medical procedures. So here is a very ugly interface. This is the patient referral service that's used in the UK. So basically, if you go to a primary healthcare clinic, a GP's clinic, and you then need to get a referral for some kind of specialist outpatient care, let's say you need to go to the ear, nose and throat department. Either the GP themselves or someone else at the surgery at the end of your appointment will look at this screen and they will need to make a decision about which hospital they're going to send you to. So it's important to say that this moment is quite stressful. In the UK, the GPs get 10 minutes per patient and they need to cycle through that fairly quickly, and there's usually a queue and waiting time. And so this is quite a stressful moment at the end of the appointment, and they want to make this decision as quickly and as easy as possible. Now, what's interesting about this screen is, so these are the clinics here at the various hospitals, and they are listed, you can see this says miles, you probably can't read that, but it does, and they're listed by distance from the GP clinic, right? So the one that comes to the top is the clinic that is closest, the hospital clinic that is closest to the GP clinic. So what happens a lot with this service is that basically the GP themselves or the other person at the GP clinic chooses this first one, or perhaps the clinic that they sent someone to before, the one they know, the hospital they know, etc. And what this means, unfortunately, is that because that's the easy choice, a lot of people get sent to hospitals where the waiting time is extremely long. So for instance, you can see here some of these waiting times, this is the indicative treatment wait, range from 50 weeks, so nearly a year, to 10 weeks here. So it really matters where you get sent, because waiting a year for your appointment is quite a long time. And what is also interesting about this is you can see the data exists, right? It's just not sorted that way. The data exists of how long you need to wait to get an appointment and then how long you need to wait to get treated. So what we did was something quite simple. We put this green box at the top, which shows clinics that are still fairly local, fairly near the GP clinic, but have good availability. So you're not going to wait too long to get an appointment at these GP clinics. And it's in this nice green box, so you know it's a good one to choose, right? And then we also say that for those that do have limited capacity, i.e. the wait time is very long, we put a red flag saying, implying, don't go there, there's limited capacity. But because this is a nudge, we don't stop them from making that decision. If they do still want to go to that hospital, say the patient has requested it specifically, and they choose limited capacity one, they get this flag which says you've selected at least one service where the patient is unlikely to receive treatment within 18 weeks, and then they can still confirm that they want to proceed and go ahead and book it. But the point is they've had a warning that that has limited availability and the patient is going to have to wait a long time. And so then we rolled this out and we saw whether we could reduce the number of patients that were referred to places where they were going to have to wait a long time. And this is what we found. When we had the red alerts, around 11% of patients of referrals were to oversubscribe clinics, i.e. where patients are going to have to wait a long time to get seen. And when we put the red alerts on, only around 7% of patients are referred to those clinics. And we find that that is equivalent to around 20 to 40,000 fewer patients going to appointments where they're going to have to wait a long time per year. So we think this matters, right? People are being seen quicker, and we're putting less pressure on trusts that already have a lot of patients who are waiting. And it's just making the service run more efficiently. But it's a very, very simple change to an interface. Okay. So the third example from health. How do we encourage doctors to prescribe fewer antibiotics? So antimicrobial resistance is really one of the great challenges of our age. A study done in the UK estimated that if we don't tackle antimicrobial resistance, there'll be something in the region of 10 million deaths from antimicrobial resistance and around $10 trillion in lost productivity by 2050. This matters, right? People are prescribing antibiotics too much, and antibiotics stop working if we prescribe them too much and people don't finish the course. So the UK's, at the time when we ran this study, the UK's 5-year strategy was to try and reduce prescribing of antibiotics by GPs in the UK by 4% over 5 years. And we thought maybe we could add to this and try and help them achieve this goal. So what we did was, we sent a letter to 3,000 GP clinics who prescribed antibiotics at a higher rate than other GP clinics in their areas. And this letter was from the UK's Chief Medical Officer, and it had 3 main components. And these 3 main components, incidentally, are our framework for applying behavioural insights. So the first one is, as I said earlier, make it easy. So in this letter we had 3 clear actionable steps of what doctors could do rather than prescribing antibiotics. So the first one was that there was a leaflet inside the letter that they could give to the patient, which talked them through easily how the patient could self-care rather than having antibiotics. And we talked to them about passing this letter on to other GPs in their clinic. So that's the first thing, make it easy. Easy to understand what you want them to do. The second thing is, the second kind of framework for applying behavioural insights is to make it attractive. One of the ways of making it attractive, as I mentioned earlier, is thinking about the messenger who is delivering the message. In this case, we got England's Chief Medical Officer, Dame Sally Davies, so this is an important person in the GP world in the UK, to send this letter so that they would pay attention. The third lesson is to make it social. So we use a social comparison message. The great majority, 80% of practices in London prescribe fewer antibiotics per head than yours. So we're telling these GPs that they're different, they're not inside the norm. Everyone else is acting differently to them. They are prescribing more than everyone else is. And the final lesson is to make it timely. So one of the things that's interesting about antibiotics is a lot of people go to the doctor and a lot of the time they have a cold, which is a virus, and so antibiotics are not effective. But if they leave the GP clinic with nothing, with no prescription, they feel like they've failed. Like, why did I bother to go? What was the point? So what we did was we gave them these delayed prescriptions. So you can, well, you probably can't read it because it's too small, but on this delayed prescription it says, it's kind of a backup. It says, if you do not feel better within 4 days, take this prescription to the pharmacy and use this prescription to get antibiotics at that point. So the beauty of this being that the patient then feels they've got something, they take a piece of paper away, and they feel like, you know, they've achieved their goal of going to the GP clinic. But actually, there's a lot of friction costs and they're probably not going to go back to the pharmacy. And anyway, as we know, most people probably will feel better in 3 to 4 days. So this is the letter we send out to the GP clinics. And then we test it. So you can see here, they're actually on top of each other, but this is before we send out the letter, prescribing rates between our treatment and control GP clinics are the same. And this varies over time, by the way, because obviously people get sicker in the winter. And then this is what you can see. So the top line, the blue line, is the control group, so the people who didn't receive the letter, and the grey line is the treatment group, so the GP clinics that did get a letter. So you can see here, this spikes because it's the winter and people are getting sick, they're getting flu, and you can see here, this is the difference. And this difference is statistically significant every single month that we run the trial. And then at the end of the trial, because this is working, we send the letter to the control group as well. And you can see that in the control group, once we send the letter to the control group here, they come together and they both reduce their prescribing behaviours. So this is really exciting. And this is equivalent to a 0.85% reduction in England's antibiotic prescription use, if we roll this out across the UK. As a reminder, the UK strategy over 5 years was to reduce it by 4%. So this is nearly a quarter of what you needed to achieve just by sending one letter. And that we also saved £92,000, but that doesn't really matter. It's kind of not that much money in the NHS budget. But this is really exciting. We then published this in The Lancet, which is a well-respected medical journal, and we've now replicated these findings in Australia as well, and had similar effects. So, easy way of tackling one of the world's biggest challenges. So that's health, and some ideas for what you can do in health. The next one that I want to talk about is education and skills. So, the first challenge is how we encourage high-achieving pupils from disadvantaged backgrounds to apply to competitive universities. So, in the UK, if you are from a disadvantaged background, your chance of going to a competitive university is 3%. If you're from an advantaged background, your chance of going to a competitive university is 21%. So there's a stark difference between that. And even when you control for exam results, so you control for their GCSE results and their A-level results, the difference still persists. So it seems that the issue is that in some cases, pupils, students from disadvantaged backgrounds simply don't apply to these competitive universities. They don't think that Russell Group universities, that Oxford and Cambridge are universities which are places for people like them. They don't know anyone who went to a university like this. So they just simply don't apply. And if you don't apply, I promise you, you can't get in. So we thought, how can we encourage these pupils to apply to these universities? And this is what we did. We took a set of pupils from schools where most of the pupils who were doing well would go to a university that was within their local area, i.e. they just went to the nearest local university rather than going to a competitive university. And so we took these students, they'd done well in their GCSEs, they'd done well in their AS levels, done well in their exams, and we sent them a letter from a pupil, a student at Bristol University. And in this letter he said, "Back in 2009, I was in exactly the same position as you. I came to realize that people with grades like you and me are in high demand from very prestigious universities." And the idea here was to show a role model, to show an example of someone else who had done this, who'd come from a similar background, who had then gone on to actually go to one of these competitive Russell Group universities. And so we sent this letter to either the pupil's home or the pupil's school, or for some of the pupils to both their home and their school. We had another student who was female who also sent a letter at different points of the year. And then we saw whether they applied. So, Russell Group, applications to the Russell Group. Russell Group is a group of universities in the UK that are highly competitive and well-respected research universities. Russell Group applications increased by 17% in the group here, where the letter was sent to the home and to the school. And also, acceptances were increased by 34%. So this is a pretty big increase for, again, it's just a simple letter that we send to someone's home and someone's school. And we've found that kind of more intensive programs, like bringing pupils in and talking to them about the advantages of university, or indeed financial incentives. So for instance, just as an aside, it is cheaper for disadvantaged students to go to a more competitive university because there are lots of subsidies and grants available than it is to go to your local university. And yet that doesn't seem to have an effect, whereas sending this simple letter does. Another interesting thing about this trial is you can see that this is the only result here that is statistically significant. So what that means is for these two results, you can't differentiate them from chance, whereas this one we're sure is effective compared to this one. But this result is driven nearly entirely by boys receiving the letter from the boy student, from the male student, and girls receiving the letter from the female student. So it seems to be that actually it matters who the role model is. If the role model is closer to you, is of the same gender, it's much more impactful whether you pay attention to that letter or not. So this is a really interesting trial, and we're interested in how this can be used in kind of other areas. Like for instance, if you want to encourage women to study STEM subjects, so science, technology, engineering, mathematics, is this something similar that you could use to encourage them and to help them to think that a STEM subject or a technical course is a place for women, and could encourage them to do that? Okay, so that's the first example. The second challenge we wanted to tackle was whether we could use student social networks to improve their learning outcomes. So what we knew is there's a lot of research that shows that there is a correlation between greater social support from your family and your friends around educational outcomes and good attainment, getting good grades, right? So if your family supports you and your friends support you, you're much more likely to get good grades. So we know that, there's a literature around that. And we were interested in whether you could improve the quality of social support students were getting through a simple text message program. So the idea was that basically parents might want to talk to their kids about what's going on at school. They might say, hi Evie, how was your day today? And if it's teenage Evie, she might be like, well, it was fine, I don't want to talk about it, and walk away, right? It makes it very difficult for parents to support the kids when they don't know what to talk about. So what we hypothesized was, maybe you could get the teacher to send a message to the parents telling them what their son or daughter was studying at school. So for instance, here's an example. Hi Kate, Raj is learning about converting between metrics and imperial units. Please ask him how many kilometers fit in a mile. Thanks, Aylesbury College. So we just send this message, right? And the idea is that subsequently, this conversation happens. So how is college going, Raj? I hear you've been learning about kilometers and miles. How many kilometers in 1 mile? So the idea is basically we sent a series of these text messages to the study supporter. And by the way, the pupil chose who the study supporter was. We didn't impose their parents upon them. A lot of them did choose parents, but others of them chose siblings or other family relatives or family friends, godparents, etc. And this study supporter, which is what we called them, was sent these messages on a regular basis over the year. And we looked at two outcomes. We looked at whether the students what their attendance was like at school, and how they then did in their GCSE exams age 16. So this is what we found. This was really encouraging. So you can imagine we get halfway through the year and we were really excited to see this, that in the study supporter group, the attendance of the pupils has increased by about 4 percentage points. And you can see it basically holds at the end of the year. We have an increase of around 3 percentage points in attendance for people who are getting the messages. But then, we had to wait till the end of the year, and this was what was really exciting. So you can see, so we're calling this passing the course, so getting an A star to C grade at GCSE. In our schools that we trialled this in, 22.2% of pupils passed the course. Not great, but 22.2% did pass the course. And this is the group who didn't get the study supporter text messages. And for those that did get the study supported text messages, we find that about 28.2% passed the course. So we send some text messages and we have a 25% increase in the number of pupils who go on to get A star to C grades at GCSE level. So this is super, super exciting. I mean, like, to get these kinds of impacts, you need to, like, usually the government invests loads of money, gets new technology, hires new teachers. We're talking about a simple text message programming improving attainment by about 25%, which is really, really exciting. So we're now rolling this out to lots of different schools and colleges across the UK because we think it's a really exciting intervention. And also, by the way, just as an aside, we think it would be interesting to use this kind of intervention in lots of different areas. Like, we think you could use this kind of intervention to encourage people to save. If you want someone to save money and they have a saving goal, let's say they're saving for a deposit for a new house, could you say, okay, I'm going to make Tim my saving supporter, and Tim gets updates about how much money I have saved every week or every month, etc. And then the social pressure or the social support, depending on how you see it, of Tim knowing about how I'm doing could actually encourage me to achieve my goals. Okay, so my penultimate section, economy. This is something we did really recently, which we're really, really excited about, actually. And this is how we can increase credit card repayments. So in the UK, if you have a credit card, it's the law. There's regulation that says your credit card company has to set a minimum repayment amount per month. And the idea of this is if they didn't do that, people would get massive spiraling debts and they would never pay off their credit cards, etc., etc. So there's a minimum amount you have to repay. Let's say for this person, they've borrowed £5,000 and the minimum amount they have to repay is £169. And this is normally, every month, lots of people in the UK go through this decision, right? How much do they want to repay this month? And normally, this is what the interface looks like. Probably a little bit prettier than this one, but nonetheless. They have a box, and they have to enter the amount into this box that they want to repay. And they are told what the minimum repayment amount is, so it's £169. We hypothesized that it would be interesting to see whether you could increase the minimum repayments, the repayments people make on their credit cards by changing this interface. And this matters, right? The larger amount you repay each month, the quicker you pay off your debt, and the less you pay in interest overall. So it really, really matters. If you doubled 169 on a £5,000 debt, just to give you an idea, if you took that from 169 to £276 on a £5,000 debt, you would pay off your debt 2 years quicker and pay £2,000 less interest over the lifetime of the debt. So it really matters, right? Getting people to pay off a little bit more. So, and we hypothesized that it might be quite interesting to use sliders. Oh, sorry, this is really cut through the middle of it here. But sliders have been used a lot in the UK financial industry, and actually specifically on lots of bad kinds of credit, like payday loans, which have thankfully been curtailed a bit in the UK. But basically, in payday loans, people can move this slider up and down and think about how much they would like to borrow. And so it's a very easy interface that people are used to, having these sliders. And we hypothesized that maybe having a slider would encourage people to pay off more every month. So you can see, so we tested 3 different variants in an online experiment. So we tell people about their circumstances, we tell them their hypothetical circumstances, we tell them how much they earn each month, we tell them about their expenditure each month, and then we ask them to make a decision about how much they want to pay off. So in this option, they have a slider, and it's set at the minimum amount, so it's set at £169, right? And they can move it up and down, and these numbers will change here that tells them how much is the total amount they repay, and the total interest they'll repay, and when they'll pay it off by. So that was the first treatment. The second treatment is exactly the same, except we place the slider, when they get to the interface, in the middle of the options. So the minimum repayment is still £169, and obviously they can pay as much as they want, but we put that in the middle. So we just changed the default. We just imply that where you might want to start paying off is here in the middle, £284 a month. And then in the third option, instead of having a slider about how much they want to pay off, we ask them when they want to pay off their debt by. So we tell them this is if they repay the minimum amount, they'll pay it off by March 2022. And if they repay the maximum amount, then they'll pay it off by February 2019. So this was run last year, obviously. And then we see how much they choose to pay off, right? with this time slider. And this is what we find. So on average, in the group where they have to enter the number, knowing what the minimum repayment is, they enter on average £219 is how much they want to pay. And in our group with the timing slider, on average they enter £270. So we find that telling people this is how long it will take you to pay off your debt actually increases the amount they choose to pay off by about £50. And so we think that's really exciting because, as I say, it will reduce the total amount of interest people pay, and it will make them pay off their debts quicker. So we think that's really, really exciting. And we're now actually rolling this out into the field to trial doing things like this with real banks and see whether changing their interfaces does increase the amount people pay off. And if this is effective in the field, we'll look for this to become a regulation in the UK that credit card providers need to design their interface in this way. Okay. So the second one on economy is how we encourage the uptake of business growth vouchers. So this is a program that happened in the UK a couple of years ago, is that the government was giving out growth vouchers to businesses. So essentially businesses would be given £2,000, which is about 50% of the cost of strategic business advice. So it might be advice on marketing or advice on HR or advice on finance and account keeping, etc. And the government was giving this away. This was a subsidy, right? But the problem was that not many people were taking up this subsidy, which was designed to, improve businesses and help SMEs to grow. So what we did was twofold. We looked at what were the touch points the government could use to encourage businesses to take up these growth vouchers. So HM Revenue and Customs, our tax authority, already had a sample of 600,000 businesses who were signed up to receive emails which included tax advice. So HMRC already owned this touch point, right? They can send emails to this group for free. So unlike, for instance, traditional above-the-line advertising, they don't have to pay for this. And they have 600,000 businesses. So we thought, can we send them an email encouraging the businesses to take up the growth vouchers program? And can we make that email behaviourally informed to see whether that can be more effective? So these were the kind of interventions we trialled. So you can see this one uses kind of scarcity and incentives. So we say the vouchers are only available for this financial year, so don't miss out. We know this is a very strong lever on people's behaviour. I don't know whether anyone tries to get you to buy sofas here, but in the UK, sofas are always sales ends Monday. Don't miss out. This is exactly this. Like, the private sector know how to do this really well, but we should be using it in government as well. So we're telling them the vouchers are only available this financial year. Then we use some salience around chosen. So people tend to pay more attention to things that they think are specific to them. That's why when the private sector sends you emails, they always say, "Hi, Evie," blah, 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 blah. Like, personalization is important. And here, if we imply that they have specifically been chosen, which in a way they have, to receive it, they're much more likely to pay attention to the message that they're seeing. This is norms. Again, you know about norms because we talked about it before. Thousands of businesses are applying for growth vouchers. This is true. And then we just talk about incentives. So we just remind them how much money is on offer with getting these growth vouchers. And then we email this out to the business. So in the control group, about 1.5% of businesses sign up and take the growth voucher. In the incentives, it's slightly better, 1.61. And you can see it goes up all the way until salience chosen, where we get up to 2.27% of businesses take up the growth vouchers. And I think this was equivalent to about 9,000 extra applications to the growth vouchers program by just simply changing this email and rolling this out. Okay. So the final example on economy is one of the trials that we actually have probably been most excited about ever, and is about how to encourage job seekers to get back into work. So this is the Job Centre Plus in Loughton in Essex. You can see this is a typical dreary UK day, looking not very attractive. And what we did was we looked at whether we could amend the job seeking process to help job seekers look for a job better, basically. The first thing we did was, remember my lesson about Make It Easy? When you first sign on in the job centre, you used to have to fill out these 9 forms, and we reduced those 9 forms down to just 2. So we simplified it. We made it much easier at the start of the process. And the other thing that we did was we amended the conversations that the job seeker advisors, so the people working in the job centre, have with the job seekers themselves. So firstly, we use something that in behavioural science we call implementation intentions. So the idea here is that you basically, if you want someone to achieve a goal, you get them to plan exactly what they're going to do, where they're going to do it, and when they're going to do it. So you can see here that it says this is their commitment. They have to say what they're going to do, when and where. So you can see, I will do a CV job at these, I can't read it here, but anyway, at these companies on Friday afternoon after lunch. So you very specifically plan what are the job seeking activities you're going to do in the next week going forward, and plan those with your advisor who's in front of you, and you make a social commitment that you're going to do it. And then anchoring. So this is one thing that's really important is, and quite interesting is, in the UK to get your benefits, you have to apply to at least 3 jobs a week, and you have to prove that you've applied to at least 3 jobs a week. The problem with this is that anchors people. People think 3 jobs a week is the number of jobs they should be applying to, and so then they only apply for 3 jobs a week. And so that's problematic. So instead of that, we said, do you think you could apply to 20 jobs this week? So we anchor them higher, and we tell them that actually just 3 jobs a week isn't normal, and maybe you're not going to get a job if you only apply to 3 jobs a week. So essentially so we had this amended process, and the way we randomized this was we had in the job centre, there were 2 floors. There's a ground floor and a first floor. And job centre advisors on the first floor in the treatment group and in the ground floor in the control group. And then we basically see whether the approach is effective. And this is what we found. We found that the percentage of job seekers finding work within 13 weeks, so about 3 months, increased by about 5 percentage points in the treatment group compared to the control group. So again, 5 percentage points might not seem like a lot, but think about people being unemployed is really, really massive, has a massive impact on public services, because not only are these people claiming benefits, etc., but also it has knock-on impacts going forward on people's mental health and a lot of other kinds of health outcomes. So we thought this was really exciting, and we then scaled this up around the country, and this is now being rolled out across the UK, across about 750 job centres, and we think this is equivalent to around 50 to 100 million pounds saved in welfare costs per year. And similarly, we've replicated this with our teams in Singapore and Australia and found similar results. So we think this is really exciting, and it's important to say that these kinds of planning interventions, getting people to use implementation intentions to plan when, where, and how they're going to do something, is not just, you can use it to achieve all kinds of goals. If you want someone to, study harder for a course that they're doing in their spare time, or to lose weight, or to stop smoking, you can use these kinds of interventions, and they've been shown to be effective in lots of different domains. Okay, so that is the economy done. Now I'm going to show you your bonus, which is just a trial that I really like presenting, so I thought I'd do it. So how do we reduce speeding? So in the UK, well, actually in the West Midlands, which is around Birmingham, England's second largest city, around 1,500 speeding notices are sent out per week. I'm sure none of my colleagues from the British Embassy have ever received something like this, but if they had, they might be familiar. So this is it has a slightly strange name, but this is called a Notice of Intended Prosecution. And it's this kind of weird letter, it's very, very ugly, that is sent out by the police, and essentially it is asking you to say whether or not, it's essentially saying your vehicle was caught on speed camera, can you declare whether or not you were the driver of the vehicle? And so you have to fill out this form and say I was the driver, or I wasn't the driver, my wife was the driver, etc. And they send out these 2 pages, and they have this also ugly leaflet that goes with it, which basically says, if you don't complete the form, you will be prosecuted, and if you lie on the form, you will be prosecuted, etc., etc. So there's lots of kind of legalese on this form. And what we wanted to do was see whether we could redesign the form and redesign the leaflet that comes with it to try and reduce speeding. And we thought this was important because basically 1,500 of these are going out per week. People pay the fine, they get some points on their license, yada yada. Does it actually change behaviour, or is this just seen as an annoying bureaucratic effort where the government is taking money from you? And we hypothesised that perhaps it was the latter, that people don't stop and think, well, maybe I should stop speeding. Maybe there was a reason that the speed cameras are there, and maybe it is dangerous to speed when they receive this letter. So what we did was we redesigned the form, which I won't show you because it's obvious how you can make that look nicer. But I will show you, this is the leaflet that we sent. So the legal stuff I was talking about, we managed to squeeze it into this little box here that we had to keep. And then we changed the form to look like this. So you can see we say, no driver means to kill, they were just going too fast. And we include this picture. In the UK, it's traditional that if someone dies in a car crash, you put flowers by the side of the road. And this is a picture of a real car crash. The flowers by the side of the road after a car crash. And then we also include some information in this letter. So we tell them that over the last 5 years, 779 children were killed or seriously injured on the roads in West Midlands alone. This is true, by the way. And we also tell them a lot of thought goes into setting speed limits. Speed limits take into account the history of accidents in the area. That's why they're there, because we don't want history to repeat itself. So, we add this leaflet with the notice of intended prosecution, and we send it out to people. And then we basically see, do they go on, how likely are they to go on and pay their fine? And we find that amending the form to make it easier to use and including this leaflet increases the payment rates by about 2 percentage points, which if you look through, if people don't pay, they then have to go to court and there's lots of effort, and it essentially costs the police and the court services quite a lot of money. So if you roll out just this alone, in terms of payment rates, that's equivalent to about £1.5 million worth of savings to the police and the court services a year. So that's quite exciting, but we didn't really care about that. We were much more interested in speeding itself. Could we reduce speeding? And this is what we find. So we looked at, if you look at the 6 months after this letter is sent out, around 3.1% of drivers in the control group went on to be caught speeding again in the next 6 months, and about only 2.45% of drivers in our control group go on to get caught speeding in the next 6 months. So we have a 21% reduction in speeding just from sending out this leaflet. So we've also, this is now being rolled out, we're trialling this with the Metropolitan Police, who are London's police force, the biggest police force in the country, in the UK. And we're trialling similar interventions with lots of other police forces, because we think this is a very simple way to reduce what is a very common and kind of dangerous behaviour that people undertake a lot. Right, that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Missy, for the interesting lecture. Now we will open the floor for the questions.
You reminded me immediately from the morning about the graphic picture we see on cigarettes. It causes cancer, death, etc. And yet we're still buying it and smoking it, and our mind doesn't pay attention to the damaged lung or to anything. So this isn't it a nudging policy? But I don't know how successful it is. On another hand, I like to see, for example, in the case of Kuwait, how to convince working in the private sector by using nudging policy. I think this will be a breakthrough. Thank you.
Yeah, it's interesting you should bring up the question of smoking. Obviously we do have all those pictures around, putting nasty pictures about the diseases you're going to get from smoking on the cigarette packets, and I believe those are effective to an extent. I think one of the interesting things that has been done is in the UK, the cigarette packets are behind, they're kind of behind a screen. Like, you can't actually see the cigarettes in the newsagents, and I wonder whether that is actually quite effective in stopping people from being able to see it. But I don't know if that's actually been evaluated rigorously. Smoking is really, really difficult to stop, right? It's got a really bad behavioural cause, which is that we are essentially present biased. So we think about, essentially, we enjoy things that give us benefits in the present, and we don't think about the costs in the future. And that's true of loads of things, right? Like, that's why we eat unhealthily, and that's why we smoke, and it's very, very difficult to counter that. One thing that has been quite interesting, I don't know whether it was about trying to counter smoking, but there was a study that was done at one university where they showed people a picture of their face but aged, and the idea is that you're meant to bring the future much closer to the person, and then because they're thinking about the future and what their life's going to be like in the future, those costs then become more salient. And that's quite an interesting intervention. I just don't know how you roll it out, like at the point of sale in shops when people are buying cigarettes. And then, talking about nudging people to work in the private sector, I think that could be really interesting. I don't know enough about the background to advise, but it could be a really interesting thing to think about how you could encourage people to do that.
Thanks for nice examples. However, nudging always is referred to as a short-term exercise, and invariably people become inured to the messages. Compared to the small percentage improvements in the examples you gave, this is a very hectic exercise that has to continue indefinitely to devise new techniques, new nudges, new messages, including the example you just gave on cigarette packs. People no longer see, smokers no longer see the ugly pictures on the cigarette packs or the warnings. You know, in the long term, how do you translate the effect of nudge theory? Thank you.
Yeah, so it's a really interesting problem and question. So we've tried to kind of follow up on lots of our interventions because we get this kind of question a lot, like, does this small intervention work over time? And what we found, the only ones we've managed to follow up on so far, because we've only been around since 2010, right? So we haven't had that long to be doing that much work and waiting for people to have long-term outcomes. But when we ran, for instance, tax trials, we have found that people without any further intervention who received the nudge letter in the treatment group were more likely to continue to pay the following 2 years than people in the control group. So we do actually find that the simple intervention once has a continued impact the next couple of years. However, I completely agree with you that I think that there's a dichotomy, right? There's behaviours that are one-off, which are attend your hospital appointment, pay your tax, lots of the other examples we talked about. And then there are behaviours that are kind of continued and habits, like losing weight or stopping smoking. And I think the latter are much harder to change. So, for instance, we have had a lot less success in trying to, for instance, encourage people to exercise more. That is really, really hard to change. I think something like the study supporter intervention, which is continued and more intense over time, might be more effective. But you're right that it's a difficult area. I don't think it's something that behavioural insights can't tackle. It's harder for us to get it right. And I think the interventions need to be larger than a nudge. And that's why we call the behavioural insights team, not the nudge unit, because there is more than nudge and you sometimes need more than nudge.
Thank you very much. I have an observation and a question. The observation first, maybe with your employment test, people that are willing to go upstairs are more aspirational and therefore the control group wasn't totally things. But the next point is there a thin line between coercion and encouragement? And the only example I could think of this was maybe diesel cars, where the government asks you to encourage people to do something which might not actually be in the public interest.
Mm-hmm. So on your first point, that is a very good question, because in fact, you are right that when we did our robustness checks after we ran the trial, the background and specifically the benefit history of the people in the upstairs and the downstairs was not the same. But the results I present control for that factor. But it is interesting, it wasn't the same. We thought that people were randomly allocated upstairs or downstairs, and it turned out it wasn't as good as random, which is what we thought. Is there a thin line between kind of coercion and influence? Yes, I think so. That is why, we are a social purpose company, and that's why we will only do social purpose projects. And we try and work for, in our case in the UK, a democratically elected government. Because we think that at least that government has been elected and therefore should be to an extent thinking about what the people want to do. But I think it is difficult, and a lot of the techniques that we're talking about here can and are used by the private sector to nudge for bad. And so I think it is really important to think about what the outcomes you're looking at are all the time.
Thank you for a very interesting lecture. Two questions. One, how does your unit function with the different government agencies in the UK and get them to cooperate? Where do you sit exactly?
Mm-hmm.
I recall, I think from the book, you in the beginning was with the Prime Minister's office somewhere. Is that still the case? And did you get resistance? And then how do you go about, I mean, I can think of in Kuwait so many areas where, you know, you would be overwhelmed where to start, right? How do you pick your projects? How do you prioritize them? And did you look at areas, I mean, where there might be existing policies that are actually nudging bad behavior? For example, in Kuwait, where we have very high obesity rates and diabetes rates, we practically give away our highly subsidized sugar and flour and all kinds of unhealthy foods. And the government continues to do that. So, and I could think of 10 other examples where we're actually nudging people to do the wrong behavior. So would you start by just looking at that and maybe stop those policies? I mean, we subsidize, like same thing, water in a country where, you know, we have no water, natural water. So how do you start, how do you prioritize when you start in a new place like Kuwait?
Okay, so taking your first question around essentially where we sit in government, how we get things done in government. So yes, you're correct. We were originally inside the Prime Minister's office, Cabinet Office. And we're now outside of government, but we are a third owned still by the Cabinet Office. The Cabinet Office is a good place to be in the UK if you want to get things done. And indeed it is, when we've worked in other countries, we have recommended that the nudge unit or equivalent behavioural insights unit sits within a government department that has that kind of central function. So the Cabinet Office in the UK has this kind of central function where it coordinates between departments and has a lot of influence to get things done across government. So that's a really good place to sit. Now for us, there's a kind of, we're kind of in a weird position. We have like our left foot is still in government, but then the rest of our body is out of government. So we're in a kind of strange arrangement. But we still have an ongoing contract with the Cabinet Office, which means we work on kind of prime ministerial priorities and Cabinet Office priorities, and that can help us to get things done in departments if a department doesn't want to work with us directly to get something or doesn't want to hire us directly to work on a project for them. But yes, I think it is really important to be in that kind of ministry or that kind of office. And also a lot of what we did was doing exactly this, going around, giving presentations and showing that this kind of approach works, managed to get us enough buy-in to get people interested in this approach, and then people were willing to try it. And then you asked about kind of how we prioritize projects. So mostly the way we prioritize projects is we look at a combination of feasibility and impact, which isn't rocket science, but I think it's especially important when you're starting out to try and get that low-hanging fruit. So essentially, a project that's going to have a big impact but is relatively easy to implement. So a lot of the early work BIT did was in tax, and the reason we did that is that tax really matters to the UK government because it's how it gets all its money, and if you can make a small change to a tax letter, which goes out to lots of people, so it's easy to trial, and you can have a big impact, that really makes a splash, which is what we did at first. Now we're in a slightly different place. Now we are potentially more interested in doing things that are beyond nudge, if you like, tackling harder problems. So we're starting to do things on harder problems like corruption, or as your colleague was talking about, things like repeated habitual behaviours rather than one-off behaviours. But that's generally how we look to prioritise our projects. And then you asked about looking at existing policies that are bad. So yeah, I think I probably didn't talk about this at the beginning, but when we work with the UK government, we probably do two things. We do things like this, projects, like we run trials to see whether things are effective, but we also give high-level policy advice. So for instance, we did quite a lot of drafting for the UK's childhood obesity strategy, and we did a lot of the work that is behind the sugar tax in the UK on fizzy drinks. And the sugar tax in the UK has worked exactly how we predicted it would, which is not that we are penalising consumers who tend to be poorer, who tend to buy more fizzy drinks, but that the companies that make the drinks terrified that no one's going to buy their drink because it's going to become more expensive because of the tax, have reformulated their drink to reduce the amount of sugar in it. And that's exactly what we thought would happen, and we hoped would happen, because there's actually no indication that customers would change their behaviour just because you put a tax on a specific product. So yes, we do quite a lot of that work also, looking at a high level, how should you change policy?
Thank you, Evie, for the interesting talk on behavioral insights, nudge theory, its applications in the UK to help people make better decisions. There's something specific that caught my attention with education, where you wanted to increase, I believe, the pupils' productivity by having the school send an SMS to the parents, and then the parents can communicate with their pupil.
Yep.
And that way you tackle the norm problem. So how is it in terms of acceptability of the idea? Since maybe the students wouldn't accept the idea if he knows that it's going through the school and they're texting the parent in order to establish the engagement and the communication between them to increase his productivity. So how do you tackle the acceptability part on the behavioral insight?
So we didn't force these students to receive these text messages. The students were given the opportunity to sign up. If they wanted to have a study supporter, they could. If they didn't have to. And then of those who chose that they were willing to have one, they were randomly allocated to get one or not to get one. And that's how we did it. So we didn't force it upon the students. And I'm not sure, I don't think that would be the right thing to do. But given that it is so effective, it might now be easier to persuade students to do it. But you're right, it's like, they're also, for some people, for some students, they might not have someone like this in their family or in their social circle who could support them like this, and therefore it won't be appropriate for everybody. But yeah, I don't think we should force it upon the students.
Yes, hi. My question is pretty much on the frequency of collecting the data to see the impact of that specific behavior or letter or effect. Normally, would you collect it on like quarterly or within a year span, or I mean, you wouldn't expect it to be instantly or so?
So it depends on the behavior you're talking about, right? So I guess, for instance, with, let's say, attending appointments, it's kind of obvious. You see whether they've attended the appointment they were meant to. But for instance, on, let's say, getting job seekers back into work, like we chose 13 weeks as our outcome measure, but you could have chosen to look at 13 weeks and 26 weeks, or also at a month, and so on. The way we usually choose that kind of line is we look at the baseline rate, and we look at what is around, when have around 50% of people done that specific behaviour. So in the UK, around 50% of people on job seekers allowance get a job within 13 weeks. So that's kind of the outcome we would look at. But it really, really depends on the specific behaviour you're looking at, I'd say.
Dear guests, thank you for attending the lecture, and see you to our upcoming events.